Hi, everybody. My name's Jen. I am the grad admissions product manager here at Magoosh. I'm here with my colleague and friend, Erika. Erika, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Erika. I am the Senior Manager of Product Engineering here at Magoosh, and I am a test prep expert. I don't know anything about admissions. I have never been to grad school, have never applied to grad school. So I'm really excited to be here with Jen because we make up the whole puzzle together.
We do. I have applied to graduate school and am this close to finishing. I'm a PhD candidate in U.S. history at Emory University. The dissertation is almost done. I'm writing the final chapter right now. So, feeling good. I have a lot of thoughts to share about the admissions process, and I'm excited to talk to you all today with Erika about how we think holistically about test prep and admissions. What's the big picture? What do tests mean? Let's actually just jump right into it.
Exciting
I'm going to
stuff.
hit our next. Cool.
All right, really quickly, while I'm switching over to our next slide, could we get some comments in the chat just saying hi and letting us know, can you see us? Can you hear us? And can you see this slideshow? Let us know. And then we'll go ahead and get going. Want to make sure we don't get too far ahead of ourselves.
We would also love to know where you're joining us from, what types of graduate programs you're thinking of applying to. It's always nice to know.
Mm-hmm. All right, I am seeing a comment that we are good. Slideshow is live. That's great. Folks can still feel free to say hi in the chat and to comment where you're joining from. All right, Jen, take it away with our goals.
So I'm going to go over our goals. Also just want to say we will take questions at the end of this session today, but feel free to drop your questions throughout the presentation. We are happy to jump in and answer them as we go through. But really what we're here to do today is learn a couple of things. We want to learn how test scores are used in admissions. We want to understand what test optional, that very buzzy term, means. And we want to know how to weigh test prep versus other components of our application. And finally, we want to give you guys all a plan for your admissions timeline. What do you need to do? When do you need to do it? How do you manage this very busy, stressful process? So let's jump right in. And we're going to jump in, and I'm going to ask Erika, who's already, said test prep expert, not into admissions, but just how much does the GRE matter in my overall application? Erika, what do you think?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, as a test prep expert, I want to say so much, so important. But the reality is even though like folks really want the answer to that question, it's not simple. It depends on so many factors. And Jen, I'm sure that is a question that you get quite a bit and also have to answer in a very roundabout way.
It is. So this is an area where I personally, can remember back to almost 7 years ago now when I was applying to graduate school and like thinking about the test, thinking about my application and worrying. And I think one of the things that I recognized in my process and when I talked to students, when I talked to thousands of students since then, is that we can really fixate on the tests. And sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes, the test does really matter. Sometimes it matters a little bit, less. Sometimes it depends. But I think for a lot of us, the test feels like one part of the application we can really control. We can't go back and change our GPA. We can't go back and have done more research or done that one work opportunity that we thought about, but we didn't do because we did something else. And so the GRE though really feels like something like, okay, I can just sit down and study. I can control this score. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And that is important, sitting down, studying and focusing on your score. However, the GRE doesn't always indicate whether you're going to get into a program or not. A really high GRE score, I don't want to say it won't help, but I've seen lots of students that have had really good GRE scores and have kind of ignored the rest of the application and haven't gotten in. I've seen way more students on the opposite side who didn't have that GRE score quite where they wanted, but really nailed the rest of the application and got into great programs. So this is something we're going to talk about the rest of today, but we really want to kind of put the GRE in context with every other part of our application. All right, so let's move on to think about how our admissions committees are actually thinking about our test scores. And this is a good place for us to take a step back and just talk about the process of getting into graduate school. So for most programs, there is an admissions committee. This is specifically, for programs that are masters or PhDs in humanities, social sciences, STEM, medicine, business, but masters and PhD programs. Typically, there's an admissions committee. At some schools, small amount of schools, that might be a sort of like set job and office. But most of the time for those programs, these are just professors that are drawn from the department who are doing their service for the year, and they're serving on the admissions committee. And so this is a good thing for us to know, is that admissions committees often change from year to year. Different people are on the committee. Those people come together, they read your entire application, they do some sort of sorting early on, and then they sort of argue it out. They say who should go in, who should not. So they're really, it's a small group of people who are looking at your application, only some of which, if any, might actually be experts in the thing you're applying to. So that's something to remember as well. So there's some key points here. Admissions committees are evaluating your test scores as part of a larger package of information. They're looking at it with your writing, your GPA, your CV, your letters of recommendation. They also can be using test scores in relation to department standards, what the average admitted student has had in the past. And some schools do have cutoffs. Some schools do have a cutoff score. I don't know, Erika, do you have thoughts about the kind of cutoff score or just in general, like how schools use that?
Yeah, I mean, with cutoff scores, and again, not an admissions expert. That's one of those scenarios where your test score is going to be very important. That's one of those scenarios where, oftentimes we're looking at average scores, for your school, for your department. But when you've got cutoff scores, that's sort of a snenario where there's a minimum, you have to exceed that amount. And there we go. Okay, test prep needs to be a significant part of that application. And I've worked with students before where that is part of their application profile. That's part of what they're dealing with. And those are the scenarios where we've worked really quite hard to get up to that particular baseline. Maybe not far above it, but we wanted to get to that baseline.
Yeah, exactly. And, a couple thoughts on those baselines. One is that it's usually lower than you think. It's not usually the very highest percentiles. And then two, there's usually a couple of different ways that schools go about it. So there's the way we like, as people applying to graduate school, people going through this process, this is the really transparent, this is a minimum score that you have to get. And this is where your research, you're going to hear me say for the next, 40 minutes, research is key. But this is where research is important. On a program's website, they'll say you need to have a score, a combined score of 300, or you need to have this score in quant or this score in verbal. We like that. Now, we're going to be totally honest and say there are some schools that have cutoff scores that aren't official, that they don't tell you about. Generally, what happens in this case is these are programs that are getting a ton of applications. If you're a program that's getting, I don't know, I'm trying to remember when I was applying to PhDs, I think one program sent us a letter at the end that was 800 people applied and we took 8, students. There's just huge numbers. And in those cases where they're dealing with hundreds of applications, oftentimes, unfortunately, schools will use sort of a minimum GRE or GPA to sort of make that first cut, just so that they're reading less applications. Not all schools do this. I know many, many schools that read every single application. I know people don't always believe that, but I know they do. And I talk to my friends who are professors who are doing that and, they're doing it. But there is that unwritten, unpublished score. I would say those are generally lower than you would think. Again, it's not, 90th percentile. It's probably not even 75th. It's lower than you think. But that is part.
I'll jump in just to say, when I have worked with students who have been working toward a baseline score, who have been working toward one of those cutoffs, they were always working directly with somebody at that school. They always had a contact. They were always someone who had done their research, was working specifically with that school to get to that score. So again, that kind of speaks to what Jen was saying about research. You got to be clued in, you got to be connected and you can do that to know that those are things that you're going to be working toward. And again, in all of those cases, like Jen was saying, those scores were lower. We were doing pretty fundamental work to make sure that we were getting to that point. It was never the folks I was working with to get 90+ percentile scores. Yeah. It's just a different world.
Yeah. And we'll pause here for a second, because I think this is a really good point that Erika made. Like, doing research is the most important thing you can do in applying to grad school. I just firmly believe that. Every grad school is different. Grad schools change. Programs change from year to year. There are some programs that I heard back from that I didn't get into that were like, yeah, we really loved your application. In a different year, we would have taken you in, but we took 2 people who studied the thing you did the year before. So we just don't have a spot. So things really do change. And so being clued in is important. And I know that can feel really overwhelming. There's a million schools. How do you get clued into all of them? For those of us that don't have family or friends that went to grad school, for those of us who are first generation college students in general, it can feel really intimidating to figure out, how do I find this out? This is where I would encourage you to reach out to 3 groups of people. We'll say 3. One is the director of graduate studies for the programs you're applying to. This is their job. Their job is to answer your questions. They generally do a really good job of this, and you should reach out to them and the admissions coordinator first if you have questions. Our admissions program here at Magoosh helps you figure out how to do that, but you want to reach out to them. You want to reach out to professors that do the kind of work you want to do. They might not always respond, but oftentimes they will, and oftentimes they're going to tell you this sort of hidden information. And then the third group that I think when I talk to applicants, they don't normally think to apply to, is reach out to current grad students. I get lots of emails every year from people who are looking to apply to my program, and I'm always happy to answer them. I'm happy to jump on a Zoom, or if someone's in town, have coffee and talk about the program. Grad students can tell you so much about a department. They're in it, they live it, they know what's going on, and they can really be a clarifying point on some of these things where you're just like, I'm not sure how important this is. So reach out to them. Jumping into the rest of the way that admissions committees are evaluating your test scores. So in addition to this part of the larger package of information, in addition to in relation to department standards, they're also thinking about how your scores compare with other people in the applicant pool. It's just a reality. I will say, especially for those of you who are applying to master's and PhD programs, I don't really know of any case where it's very hard for me to imagine 2 identical students and the only thing separating them is a GRE score. It's possible, but because in admissions fit is so important, your research is so important, what you want to study, it's just really rare that everything else on paper would be the same. That said, committees are looking to put together a diverse, strong pool of candidates, and they are considering scores, kind of how you fall against other people. Don't get freaked out by the average admitted student profile. I don't know, Erika, if you have thoughts on thinking about the average admitted student and how you should think about your score in comparison to that.
It's really so funny because the exact thing that you were saying, Jen, about, oh, I can't think of a world where there's like two identical candidates and the only thing that separates them is their test score. It's so funny because in the world of like, undergrad admissions and also the world of business school admissions, like we do that case study a lot. That's the thing that we communicate a lot. And something like your test score could be the distinguishing factor in those worlds. But when it comes to grad admissions, there's so much specialization that thing that you hear for like pretty much all other types of admissions doesn't apply as much, and that's what makes this kind of unique as an admissions landscape.
Yeah, it's definitely, you are much more likely to have that sort of tiebreaker, for lack of a better word, in these programs be something like a co-authorship on a publication or a research project that you designed, or your writing sample if you have to submit a writing sample, or just your research proposal. Just, like, oh, that is an interesting idea and it fits really well with what our current students and professors are doing, or you'd fit really well into this lab. You have this particular skill set. You've worked with this type of equipment before, or you've worked in this environment. Those are the sort of things that generally work as tiebreaker, more so than the GRE. But like I said, the GRE, they're looking at these packages holistically, and the GRE is a part of it. The final way that admissions committees can be evaluating your test scores, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but is for potential funding. We're going to talk about this when we jump into test optional especially, but funding packages for schools that don't offer the same funding for every person in their program are dependent on these more sort of quantifiable parts of the application. They just are. If you are applying for a program at a state school, for example, not just state schools, but at a state school or a program where funding is determined at the graduate school level and not the like program level, and not everybody gets the same funding, and maybe some people get funding and some people don't get funding, those programs need something that they can consider fair as a way of evaluating who should get funding. And if you're a person in charge of the graduate school who doesn't have expertise on biochemical engineering or US history or 18th century English literature, it's really hard to be like, oh yeah, this is a great proposal, we should give this person money. And so in those cases, they really are looking at things like GPA, GRE, other sort of quantifiable numbers, because they can very easily put them in a spreadsheet and be like, here are the top performers. So if funding is important to you and you're applying to schools that have, kind of varied funding streams, your test score is going to matter. And admissions committees sometimes will put forward certain students with those strong profiles for different funding packages. So that's an area where you really want to consider the GRE score. All right. So we've talked big picture, but let's talk about like, when can a great score actually help me? Like, when does it really, really, kind of push me over the edge? And I think the first case is definitely for competitive programs. For ultra competitive programs, a great score is going to matter. It's going to lift your application. For programs where it's just really, my example is always like, if you're applying to a top 10 PhD program in economics, like you got to have a really high quant score. You just do. It's the reality of it. But competitive programs, that can matter. Do you have any thoughts on that, Erika, or on this next one on low GPA?
I do. I'll let you go first, but then I'll jump in.
So we want to think about like, what is the GRE doing? And on paper, it's proving your ability to do graduate, work. In reality, for all of those who've started studying for the GRE, for those of us who have tutored the GRE and taken the GRE, it's really like figuring out these sort of logic puzzles. Like, how do I think critically? And that seems trite, but It actually is what the test is doing. And that can provide this sort of baseline information for schools. But in reality, what it does more than that is allow you an opportunity to sort of showcase a set of skills, to showcase growth, to showcase, hey, I know my GPA wasn't great in the past, but actually I'm really confident and comfortable with this work. I can nail the math, I can nail the English, and more importantly, I can nail sitting down to do this hard test, which is a part of graduate school, doing these hard tests. I can study for a specific purpose. So for those of you who have a low GPA or a GPA that isn't quite where you want it to be, the GRE can show growth and can show aptitude. What are your thoughts, Erika?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe kind of getting into the next one a little bit, but this applies not just to overall GPA, but to like specifically how you performed within your course load. So if, say, in your course load you were really, really strong in, say, your more verbal oriented, humanities oriented classes, but maybe not as strong in your math classes, really performing well in the quant section can demonstrate, again, that critical thinking part of the math, where we have a very specific set of math concepts and those are used to demonstrate that critical thinking. If you can perform well on that quant section, then they go, okay, all right, we saw some weakness maybe here in these math classes, but we demonstrated the high quant that really kind of gets at what we need. So it helps to kind of balance that out and make that red flag a little bit less red.
Absolutely. Great point. And this does tie into this sort of switching fields. I work with a lot of students who start in one field and realize like, oh, actually, I don't want to go to graduate school in that. I want to do something else. And the GRE is not going to be a replacement for prerequisite coursework, for example. If you were, a comp lit major and you never took an advanced level math class, you're going to have a hard time applying to a graduate program, a PhD program in math. You're going to have to find a way to audit courses or show that like you have that prerequisite knowledge. And that's more to do with like, you just wouldn't be prepared to start your studies without that knowledge. But let's say you are you were an English, like you were that comp lit major and you really focused on like science-based literature, and you did take some science classes and you want to go into a history of science program for graduate school. And you, in those cases, the GRE can really show like, hey, I know I was an English major, but I do have that science background and I can do the math that's required here. Vice versa. You're a math major, you're a science major, and you want to go into a humanity or a social science. This can help there. We have just a follow-up here question on low college GPA when preparing for the GRE. You can't change your GPA. Unfortunately, there are two things that you can do, though. You can focus on the GRE as a way to show like, hey, I do have these skills and I can perform well. And then for most programs, there's going to be a place where you can address that low GPA. We don't want to make excuses, but we want to show that like, hey, this thing happened. Here's how I've rectified it. And this is how I'm going to do this work going forward. I will say this is a little bit off topic, but I hear it from students a lot. Low GPA can be an obstacle to overcome, for sure. But one thing I hear from students a lot is like, I had a really bad freshman year, or I had a really bad sophomore year. I had one semester that was really bad. Again, committees think about applications holistically. They definitely value upward trends. So they know freshman year of college is hard. It's a big adjustment. Most of us, struggle a little bit with that. And so if you have that kind of rough start, but your GPA goes up, even if your overall GPA isn't where you want it to be, but that last year or two of school is really, you nailed it, or you showed improvement, that's going to, be valued more than like your freshman year, you did really bad. So that's one thing. I know we have some other questions. I promise we're paying attention to them and we will come to them as we go forward. But let's think about when a score matters maybe a little bit less. Okay, so the first one I'm gonna acknowledge here, and then in our next slide, Erika's gonna talk a little bit more, but a score can matter a little bit less in test optional programs. I put this maybe in here as sort of a disclaimer, not because I'm trying to not answer the question, but test optional for some students can really mean you don't have to think about the test, or you don't have to think as hard about the test. We'll talk more about that, I promise, in just a minute. The other two places where a score can matter a little bit less is if your program has other priorities. And this is where, again, research is key. Is the program you're applying to, do they really value experience in the field, or really value research experience? What they care about is that you've taken research-heavy classes, that you've worked in a lab, that you've helped design an experiment, that you've done graduate level like research writing. If you're a historian or someone in the humanities, like, do they want to know that you've gone to the archives before? Those things, if that's really what they value, like, that's what you're going to want to focus, either getting more experience or crafting an application that showcases that you have that experience. Maybe you're applying to a program that really wants to know that you've done certain coursework. And in that case, you're going to want to talk about that in your essays. You're going to want to highlight that in your CV. And that's going to be a better use of your time than a test where they're like, we kind of care about it. The other big one, and Erika may have some thoughts on this as well, is really knowing, does your school care about your overall score? Do they care about your quant score? Do they care about your verbal score? If they do, you should let that guide your prep. In my case, I was applying to history programs. And I'm not a historian of science. They did not care about my quant scores. They did not look at my quant scores. And in that case, that should really inform how you approach your prep. I wonder, Erika, like, what your thoughts are when you're working with a student that has like that kind of one priority over another.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because you're applying to a slate of schools and a slate of programs, and sometimes I see, a student really latches on to one program or one school and the trends for that one program or that one school. And that, I think, can be a little bit dangerous, which again just kind of speaks to know what you're doing, know what your plan is, know what you need to know for all of your schools, for all of your programs. So then you can do everything that you need to do across the board. So if, say, multiple of your programs, they're really going to care about verbal, but one of your programs, they want to see the whole picture, right? Okay, then you got to do the whole thing. You got to be focused on both sections. In those cases where you do really want to focus on one section because of the programs or because of the schools that you're applying to, I typically recommend giving a little bit of attention to the other section, just to give you, the options, to keep the door open, but there I do recommend, prioritizing what's important. You're always going to prioritize where you're weaker, but you're also going to prioritize where it matters, right? Mm-hmm. So in those cases, I would recommend, doing a more proportional or less proportional split and spending more of your time on that other section, and then just giving a little bit of effort here and there just to maintain those other sections and make sure they're not throwing you off on test day.
Yeah, absolutely. I would never encourage you to not at all study a part of the test, partially because, as we talked about, funding matters, and where an admissions committee may be looking at just your quant or your verbal score, a graduate school who's also involved in this decision making may be looking at the whole score. And we'll talk more about that sort of two-stage evaluation here in a minute. I would also say, I know I got this question a lot when I was a GRE test prep tutor and expert. I'm sure, Erika, you got this a lot. I would never, ever recommend anyone to skip a section. Like, don't skip the math because you think your school only cares about the verbal. Erika may have some more thoughts on that, but like, just don't do it. Take the whole test, even if
You just don't do it. I mean, it's kind of a similar thing to that trajectory, that upward trajectory, where when they see that, they see resilience, right? They see, hey, you stuck it out, you pushed through, and you're improving over time. It's more a, it shows your performance, but it also shows like your mentality, right? It shows something about you. And when you skip a section, that shows something about you, right? And it's not a good thing. So you want to show that you're giving it a shot. You're giving it a fair shake. You're giving it a go. You're trying your best, and maybe it doesn't matter as much to you. Maybe it's maybe not your strongest section, but you're at least giving it a go, and that demonstrates something about your character to those programs. So I never recommend skipping a section, even if it wasn't something you focused on, even if you think you would perform better if you just did the other sections. Just give it a fair shake, get it done, and then that's it.
I will say one of the most common things that students who work with me hear, if you're watching our admissions videos in the admissions product you're hearing, is don't make the admissions committee ask questions they weren't going to ask. And so in this particular case, a committee that's really valuing, let's say, the quant score and not the verbal score, you submit a total application, total GRE score, your quant score is great, your verbal's not so much. And they just kind of glide on past that verbal score. You submit a score that doesn't have the verbal, and suddenly they're asking, wait a minute, why didn't you do the verbal? So something that didn't matter can end up mattering there. In that case, a lower score is better than no score. I think in most cases, a lower score is better than no score. So just throwing that out there. Before we jump into test optional, I do want to say one more note for those of you, our students who are joining that are students from outside the US applying to US schools. The GRE, unfortunately, can just matter more for you when you're applying. We talked a little bit earlier, when can a great score help? And we talked about with a low GPA or switching fields. For international applicants to US schools, this is also a place to show that you can do graduate level work in English. You're taking one of the language exams most likely, but that's not testing the same sort of skill set. I think Erika probably has some thoughts on this. It's not testing the same sort of skill set. So for international applicants, this can be a really good way to show hey, my English skills especially are going to be sufficient to get through a program, especially for international applicants who went to a program not based in English. And that can count for both quant and the English section. The quant section also is showing that you can do this work in English. Also, funding just is harder for international applicants, and the test scores can matter there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that scenario as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent some time working with TOEFL specifically, and that might be an exam that you're taking, and it's not dissimilar to GRE verbal. They are reasonably similar, but you're right, there is no quant component, so that's another level that you're demonstrating. And then I find that there is a little bit more of that critical thinking, reasoning element in the verbal section on the GRE that you can demonstrate. If you're taking the GMAT, that's a whole different ballgame. That verbal section is very different from what you might demonstrate on a test like the TOEFL. And so that's a world where you would really want to perform well on both, because that demonstrates that you can take those verbal skills and then you can translate them into logic, into really kind of deeply understanding the implications behind text.
Yeah, the other thing I would just add on that is that often the TOEFL or IELTS, those are tests that are evaluated at the graduate school level. They're sort of requirements for international applicants to be able to study at the school. Those scores aren't always or often looked at by the admissions committee, who just aren't familiar with that test. They're not super familiar with the GRE either, because it's been a while since they took it, probably. But they do know that because they look at it year after year. So that's an area where they're just going to be more familiar and may not even be looking at the language score. So wanted to call that out. We're about halfway through. Erika, you want to talk about the topic on everybody's mind?
Oh, absolutely. I love talking about test optional. So if you've been following the world of admissions for a while, you know that test optional is something that has been, it was there. There were some schools that were doing it, say 5 years ago and before that. But test optional really has kind of come into play more broadly in the last couple to a few years. And it's become a lot more prominent. Some schools are walking it back a little bit. We're seeing maybe it's a little less prominent than it's been, but it's still something that we see quite a bit. And it's one of those things that I'm seeing students latch onto a lot. This idea the test is optional. I don't have to do it. But what I see is that there is a really massive misunderstanding about what test optional actually means. So let's talk about what optional means. And especially let's talk about it in contrast with like, we don't take scores or we are test blind, because that's a thing that exists. It's more common kind of at the undergrad level, but it's something that exists in some places. And that is where truly they just will not take your scores, or you can submit it, but they will not look at it. And I think that's what a lot of people hear when they hear test optional. That's not what it means. Test optional means you do not have to submit a score. We will still look at your application if you don't have a score. You can still get in if you don't have a score. But if you do submit a score, we are going to look, and it is something that's just another factor in the application. All right. So like Jen was saying, it's kind of rare where that test score is the only distinguishing factor, right? It's the only thing, and it's going to get you in if it's the one thing that's different between you and another applicant. And while that's the case, it is a factor. It is something that is there. It is something that can help, like we were talking about, accommodate and kind of balance out other things on your application. It is something that can kind of push you above a threshold in combination with other things, right? It's another opportunity to show that you are strong in quant, either just say that like this is a skill or something that you're strong at across your GPA and your test and your experience in the workplace, or it can be something to balance it out. So it is a factor. They will look. They do care at a school that is test optional. Now, another factor here, and Jen, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more. There was a chunk of time there where we couldn't really speak to exactly how much test optional is going to mean in admissions, but we got this bullet here that's saying, hey, the program says the test is optional, but then when we look at the average admitted student, they did take the test and their scores are high. Jen, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so this is definitely something that's developing. And, I want to also acknowledge that, as Erika said, this is something that's really taken off in the past couple of years. And partially, the big reason it took off was because of the pandemic. There were lots of inequities and access to the digital only test. It was hard to do. And then when test centers started opening up, there were lots of inequities about where test centers were opening up and the ability to go and who could go to an in-person test. So there were these sort of material conditions that affected this. So we have this like stream of schools that were going test optional. Anyway, I belong to a school that shortly after I joined got rid of the test. We do not actually, we're not test optional. We don't take the test for most of our programs. And that's a school that's committed to like, we don't think that this actually helps evaluate whether or not you're going to do well on the GRE. And full disclosure, I am a person who does not think that the GRE is a good indicator of whether or not you're going to do well in grad school. I think it's an obstacle that many of us have to overcome to go to grad school. And as long as that exists, we're here to help you do that. But I'm not pro GRE here. But I think what we are seeing is these sort of not half measures, but kind of half measures where programs are like, we don't want to say that this isn't important. And there are some valid like other viewpoints on like whether or not tests improve access, getting rid of tests. So it's a broad subject. I will say though, we're starting to see data that comes out that shows that the schools that are test optional are getting much higher GRE scores than schools that are not test optional. And, there's some hypothesis about why that is. I don't feel comfortable like saying why that is or what it isn't, but I think it's something that we should be aware of. And so I would say personally that if I was doing my research and I saw a school that said it was test optional, but I saw that like the average admitted students numbers for the year before had high scores, doesn't necessarily inform what I need my score goal to be, but it would tell me I should take the test in that case. And I would advise a student to take the test in that case, because, it's not causation. It could be correlation. It could be that like the students that have the high test scores also have the other parts on their application that, it doesn't necessarily, but from what we can tell, I would say that would be a case where you want to take the test. I don't know, Erika, what would you advise a student in that case?
I mean, again, coming at it from test prep, I advise if the school is not fully test blind, they do not take the score. If it is optional, you should take the test. You should do it. And if your score is even average for that school, you should submit it. The only case where I would say maybe don't submit your score would be if it is like actively detracting from your application. But I generally advise at this point, test optional is so new, right? It's been around for a couple of years, so we're starting to get data, but it is still so new. And we don't know quite yet what exactly schools want or what they're going to continue wanting. And schools don't really know what they want. They're still figuring it out. And so just having it provides you safety. It provides you options. Test options.
Yes.
So I really recommend taking the exam if it's test optional. Maybe it's not as big of a deal as it used to be. And again, that's not to say don't care about the other parts of your application. This is the most important thing, but it is a piece. And so I recommend pretty much across the board, take the test.
I would recommend that as well. I think unless you have really, really good reason to believe, like they say test optional and like it really only is going to help, like boost up, not like, it could, or you have those like, oh, my GPA is low, or like I don't have, you have those reasons. I would say take it. We'll talk in a few minutes when we talk about timelines about what that means in terms of how much time you should spend on a test at a test optional place. But there's this last factor, Erika, I don't know if you want to take it or if you want me to, about funding.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what Jen was saying earlier, and this is something that, as someone who's focused more on the test side of things and who spent a lot of time, with GMAT, with undergrad admissions, that I don't think about as much. I have the students who come to me and they say, this is the score I want, and I just don't really question it. That there are those two pieces, right? There's the getting in, but then there's also the funding piece of it. And whereas test optional more applies to getting in, it does not really apply to that funding piece of it. And Jen, you can speak to that a little bit more and the sort of disadvantage that students might put themselves at if they don't take the test.
Yeah, definitely. So there are some programs where the admissions committee isn't looking at the test or doesn't really care about the test for admission to their program. So when you apply to a graduate school, you are applying to a specific program. So in my case, I was applying to a history department. I had to go through a number of layers within that. I had to have the U.S. historians say, yes, we want Jen. She should come to our school. But then they had to go to the rest of the historians and say, like, Jen over this student, or like, this is why we need to take another U.S. historian instead of a historian from another area, or like, they're making a balanced cohort of people who study different areas, different time periods. So I went through all of that. The GRE didn't really matter that much. We weren't test optional at that time. They looked at my verbal scores. And I'm luckily at a program where the program that I ended up enrolling at is a program that has the same funding for everyone. Everybody admitted to a PhD program gets the same funding package. So it didn't really factor into my funding. There are other schools that I got into. University of Michigan was one of them, where they didn't at the time have the same funding packages. So some people I got a really great funding package because I did have a good GPA and GRE score and some other things on my application. But there were people who got into the program but got less funding. And so you want to think about the admissions process. This is different than the way other, like especially undergrad. I mean, undergrad funding is also, it's its own world. We'll just put that aside. We'll put aside undergrad funding. But this is one where you can get admitted to a program and get funding in a slightly different way. So you really want to do your research here and understand who's looking at my score, what is the process, what does funding look like. Oftentimes I talk to students who don't think about funding until after they've put in their applications and they get their schools back. I know this happens in undergrad all the time as well. And there's nothing more disappointing than getting into a program you really wanted to go to and not being able to go because the funding isn't there. So understanding funding from jump, I think, is really important. I know we're running close on time and we want to talk about timeline, but Erika, I'm going to ask you the question here and then another question. So,
oh, nice.
What do I do? I think we kind of answered this, but what do I do if it seems like everybody else is submitting a test to a test optional program? What does that tell me?
It tells me you should take the test. It tells me you should do it. Don't put yourself at a disadvantage in this kind of changing and shifting landscape. Give yourself the best shot of getting in. But it also tells me, do your research, right? If you are concerned, right? You're hearing test option or you're hearing a different term and you're like, what exactly does that mean? Look into it, contact a real human being, talk to them, both, in the programs and like Jen was saying, contact students, someone who's been admitted in the last couple of years, talk to them, about how much attention they paid to their test scores, and do this across your schools, across your programs, to make sure that you're making an informed decision. A lot of folks are hearing test optional and they're going, great, nice, don't have to take it. Don't let that be you. Really think it through. If you're not going to take the test, make sure you have a good reason for it.
Cool. So this is somewhat related. This is my surprise question. What if I'm applying to like 7 schools and 6 of them don't take the test and 1 is test optional? What do you think in that case?
I mean, it's a frustrating one because the first question I would ask is, do you really want to go to that 7th school?
Yeah.
Because if you really do want to go to that 7th school, I would say take the test.
Yeah.
This is a big deal, right? Grad school is a big thing, right? You are really investing in these applications, monetarily, in your time, it's effort. And so I really recommend, like, if you are going through the effort to apply to that 7th school, do take the test. But I would really kind of take a step back and go, like, how much does this one matter to me? Like, is this one of the ones that I really want to go to, or am I just applying to apply? And I don't know how common that is in the world of grad admissions, applying to apply, because I know it is maybe a little more common in the world of MBA admissions, in the world of undergrad admissions. But that would be the first thing I would say is, like, let's evaluate.
Well, we can definitely have another live stream at a time where we talk about how to pick your schools and applying just to apply. But I would say pretty much the same thing. I think, I would weigh what the rest of this is a case where, let's say most of my schools, all but one of my schools we don't take the test and 1 is test optional. This is a case where I would really sit down and maybe not make the rest of my application, but think about the rest of my application and really think about, critically, how strong is my coursework? How strong is my writing sample going to be? How strong are my letters of recommendation going to be? And if I felt really confident about the rest of that, then I would maybe think about not taking it, especially if I'm working a full-time job. If, like, taking the test is just going to be like an effort level and a time level that's just not as important. If you're doing like a really critical, like, research or internship program, those would be some situations where I would think about not maybe not taking it. And then also evaluating, like, I want to be really transparent. Tests cost money, unfortunately. And, you know, that's a factor that you're weighing in as well. I will say, you know, it's not cheap to take the test at all. If you only have to submit 4 or less scores, like, you're not going to have to do what I did when I applied for 14 schools and had to spend a lot of money going out there. It's tough out here getting into a PhD program. I would have maybe applied to a couple less, but not many. But yeah, I would really think about that. And I would really, again, like Erika said, think about, do I want to go to this school, and why do I want to go to this school? Is it a good fit? If it is a good fit, if it's I hear a lot of times from students where that is their like number one choice, then you should like gear your application to that school and really do whatever you can. You don't want to have regrets at the end of the day. You don't want to be asking yourself, like, this is such a hard process. There's so many moving parts. You don't want to sit back and say, like, if I had taken the GRE, would that have helped? All right, let's talk about how we do this.
All right. How much time do I spend on test prep? All right. And this is a particularly important question in this world of test optional, especially in this hypothetical situation where you've only got that one school, right? That maybe cares about the test. This is where this really matters, because you don't want to overinvest in the GRE if it means under investing in other areas, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But let's start with what do I do to figure out how much time I need to spend on test prep? Where do we go? So the first thing is you need to figure out, what do I need? What sort of score am I looking for? And that speaks to research, right? You don't just want to say, like, I want a 99th percentile score, I want a 95th percentile score, just because that sounds good, right? I think a lot of folks kind of get caught in that, like, I need a score that looks like this. No, what do you need for your programs? Does it matter the total score? Does it matter specific section scores? What do you need? Get really, really clear on that. Then you want to get clear on where you are now. And this is the most important thing across the board. I see a lot of folks just jump right into studying, right? Immediately they're in a book or they're doing practice questions. No. First thing you want to do is take a practice test. Full length, official, real deal, all in one sitting, realistic practice test. And that will tell you where you start. And then you can look at your percentile for the whole thing, for the individual sections, and how that compares to those percentiles of where you want to get to. And that gives you kind of an idea of how much you need to improve. Because you could have a goal of a score and you could only need to improve a couple of points. All right, so then maybe we're thinking a shorter timeline. Typically, minimum I recommend is a month, right? We're going, okay, maybe a month will do it for me. But if we have that same goal score and we're starting a lot lower, there we're having to make maybe more changes, and maybe more like fundamental changes, the sort of changes that are harder to make. Maybe there's content learning and strategy learning that's going into that. There we might go, okay, now I want a few months to study. Typically, the range that I recommend of like healthy study timelines are usually between 1 and 6 months, but where in there you fit is going to have a lot to do with how much you want to improve, as well as how much you're going to be studying kind of on a weekly basis, depending on your other priorities. So that's the first thing. Evaluate where you want to go and where you're starting. Once you have that, we can go, when do I want to get started, right? Now, if you're only a month out, okay, I guess you're studying for a month, which is why we want to figure this out early. We want to take that practice test as soon as we know we are going to be taking the GRE or the GMAT or whatever. We want to get that understanding soon so that we can take as much time as we need. So the GRE takes a long time. Applications as well take a long time. So you want to get started early, and you want to be prepared and know what's ahead of you so you don't run out of time. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that we're not neglecting other areas. We don't want to be spending 6 months on the GRE and then rushing through your written materials, rushing through your essays. That's not a good idea, because again, GRE is just one factor, right? The test is just one factor. The other factors are critical. So I recommend a lot of students take the test and then they work on their application. I actually recommend working on them at the same time. And that can help, one, make sure that you're not over studying and making mistakes and things aren't clicking with you, but it can ensure that you're focusing on both pieces, that you've got the ability to switch gears and spend the time on something that maybe your brain's a little fresher on while you're studying or writing essays or whatever. And it ensures that you're going to be able to spend time across all of the areas that you need to spend time. Jen, you got anything to add?
Just a couple things. So, Erika said applications take more time than you think. They really do. Even things as simple as like the application itself, just the part where you go in and like you fill out all the demographic information. And don't be me. Don't make my mistakes. Don't have it be Christmas Eve and be filling all of these out because you're like, that'll be easy to fill out those forms. They can take, at Harvard, for example, their form at the time that I applied involved me having to manually input all of the classes I had taken, even though they got my transcripts. I don't know why, but that was the thing I had to do. So those sort of things, the things you don't think are going to take a lot of time, do. And then this factor that is like, actually does just take a lot of time is the written materials. If you take our admissions course, if you hear me on any other place, if you write into Magoosh, you're going to know that I think that for 9 out of 10, applicants and programs, your written materials, your statement of purpose, your personal statement are far and away the most important part of your application. If we think of everything else in your application as a set of like numbers and like, dates or class titles, your written materials are the one place, with the exception of the letters of rec, which are coming from another point of view, they're the one place where you get to put all of those numbers together in your own personal story. And that's really, really important. You get to make sense of that. So for those of you, I see in the chat here, someone who's making the switch to cybersecurity, switching from HR to cybersecurity. This is where you get to talk about why you're doing that. What drove you to make that decision? What skills do you have that are going to do well here? You've worked in cybersecurity for 1.5 years. Your written materials are where you get to present that. This is where, if you have that low college GPA, you're going to get to explain it and talk about what you've learned. So don't underestimate these. Again, don't be me. Don't be my students sometimes on the college campus and like think like, I can write that essay. We've all been there. We've all written an essay the night before. This is not the essay you want to do that for. You want to take time. And then the final thing I would just say is in relation to test prep. When I was a GRE tutor, this is something that I worked with students a lot on. Be honest with yourself about what you need to do, but also how much time you have. I would talk to students like my first session so many times where they'd be like, I'm going to study for 4 hours a day. And then we'd have to talk about like, okay, like, one, should you? I don't think you actually should.
You shouldn't.
But do you actually have that time? I would talk to students who would be like, yeah, I'm going to take the test in 3 weeks and I want to make this score improvement. And like, I'm just going to study every day, all day. Again, you shouldn't do that. It's not good for actually learning or doing well on the test, but also, do you really have 4 hours in the day? So be really honest about that timeline. And this is where starting early can help. You can really say, hey, yeah, you know what? My family always takes a vacation for 2 weeks in June and I want to do that. And to be honest, I'm not going to study those 2 weeks. I'm just not. And you can build that into your timeline if you start early enough. So just be honest with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Totally agree. I've seen it so many times. The student who says, yeah, I'm going to study a full-time job, 40 hours.
Yep.
Do not recommend. I find that the students who are most successful with their studies are the folks who are balanced in their studies, who have a reasonable amount of time and maybe break up that time with, I don't know, work on the other parts of their application, or like, I don't know, living their lives, working their jobs. So again, start early so you can create a schedule that is sustainable and that you're not going to burn out and end up writing your essay the night before. All right. Timeline. So we've kind of hit all of these pieces. So this is kind of a recap of what we've been talking about this whole time. But what do we want to do first? Then where do we go? Then where do we go? So first thing is always research. First thing is always looking at the schools that you're applying to, looking at the programs that you're applying to, making sure that that list is correct, right? Really critically evaluating what you actually want out of this. And then in that research process going, okay, what do we need for the whole application? What do we also need for the test scores? Jen, do you have anything that you want to add on this?
Nope, this is pretty much it. Do that research, get that first test. And the one thing that I would just do is when you're making that initial timeline, I think Erika might have thoughts for this. I know we're at time, but I think this is really important. I always recommend to students work backwards, make your timeline backwards from when your first application is due. From there, think about how many weeks it would take to get a test score in, and always plan for taking 2 tests. Now, we hope that you only have to take 1. We only want to give ETS your money once. We only want you to have to sit through this test once and never have to think about it again. But things happen. And those things can be you don't get a score you want, or those things can be you wake up the morning of the exam and you're super sick, or you hit a traffic jam and you're just thrown off. And so again, and you're doing your research and doing your planning, I really advise you to make that timeline with the idea that you're going to take 2 test attempts. Again, hopefully you don't have to take the second one and you're just done the first time and then got wide open space in front of you. But it's much easier to plan that from the beginning than to scramble when you take your first attempt too close to the application deadline. And then you're in a position where you're trying to figure out, like, do I have to not apply now? Do I have to apply with this score? So that would be the one thing that I would think about as well in your timeline.
Absolutely. So we're going to research. We're going to do our first test attempt, and notice that there's a plus sign between those. Yeah. It's not linear, right? Yeah. So we're going to research. We're going to do our first test attempt. Maybe there's a slight period of reevaluation here, based on here's where I am, here's where I need to go. How much do I care about that one test optional program? And also, like, how much do I care about having the test as part of my application for that test optional program? And then we get into building out that full timeline, bringing together the application.
Yeah. This is also where, to add one little thing, this is where research is not something, research is an ongoing process. Research happens throughout. This is in general. If you were my student in a history class, I would say this as well. We don't do research and then we're finished and we go on next. It's really the case here. So you may do some research in the next month or 2 about the schools you want to apply to, and then reach out to professors and find new information. One of your recommenders may say, like, hey, I looked at the list of schools you're applying to and you're not applying to this school. So research is an ongoing process. These are connected together for a reason.
Awesome. Okay. We have maybe a little bit of time for Q&A. I don't know, Jen, how much time you
I can do a little bit of time.
But maybe first, let's quickly chat about this. Jen, if you want to take that away.
Yeah, so for those of you who are jumping in to your test prep and your admissions journey, we have a special bundle that's just for you. So this gets you 6 months of access to our Magoosh GRE premium content, 12 months of access to our admissions support, which includes over 40 graduate application videos. More than half of those are dedicated to writing and walking you through the process of applying. There are real statement of purpose and personal statement samples, including mine. You can read what I thought I was going to study 7 years ago. You can write me an email and ask me questions about it. There are templates. There's new content added weekly where we answer questions from you and students just like you. So lots of material there. You also can look at just admissions alone or GRE alone. But like Erika said, this is a great deal. I think it's worthwhile to get support on both aspects from the beginning. We're going to help you plan from beginning to end, how to get where you want to go.
Awesome. Okay, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. We are over, so we'll stick around for maybe 5-10 more minutes. We have a couple of questions in the chat already that I can pop up on the screen, but if you have additional questions, please throw those in the chat. We can answer those now or potentially later in the comments. Okay, so first question, we talked about this a little bit already. This question from Ahmad about applying to an MS cybersecurity field.
Yeah, so I will say in general, like we can't tell you is this score good enough for your particular program. Like this is where we just don't have that information. I would say in this case, I can speak to the sort of rest of this. Maybe Erika, you can talk through how you would decide whether you wanted to take a retake, how you guide students through that. But I will say, I know, Ahmad, you have in your follow-up comment here that if you worked in cybersecurity for a year and a half, you have a non-relevant bachelor's degree. Yes, I think that like having experience in the field is really important, even if you don't have that academic experience. You know, part of this depends on, is the program you're applying to more professional based than academic based? You know, if it's a program that really wants a lot of research, that could be a little bit more difficult. But if it's a program that's training you to do this professionally and you've already been doing it, I think that is a really important and like valuable part of your application. And I'll just take this moment to sort of zoom out before I throw to Erika about how do we think about whether or not we need to take a retake. Graduate students are interesting people in the university landscape. So unlike in undergrad where you are purely a student, graduate students are students. They are colleagues of professors that are also often doing research, you know, kind of comparably on the same level. In many cases, maybe not in this particular case, but in many cases you're a teacher. Or you are you're part of the labor force in some way, like you're grading papers, you're doing research. And so you fit a lot of different bubbles. And this is where like that professional experience, where those sort of skills can be really important to convey to schools where they really value it. It's also largely something where nobody's actually telling you how to do it or where to do it. Like I am figuring out how to write a dissertation by writing a dissertation. Nobody told me this is how you do this. So you're a little individual project manager for your graduate experience. And this is where your skills doing those sort of things, putting together a project, working with a team, figuring out your own timeline, your own schedule, where you have those skills that maybe you're like, I worked a job and like it doesn't apply to this particular academic research. Actually, it really does. Being able to show that you're a self-starter, that you're well organized, that you can manage a project, that you can organize it, it's really, really important because they want to know not just like, can you do the coursework? They want to know like you can see through this complex research from beginning to end. But Erika, how would you advise someone to start thinking about, should I take a retake?
Yeah, I think a big question at this point is, how much time are we working with here? You know, both in terms of like, what's your timeline before you're applying, but also like, how much availability do you actually have? And how much progress have you made on the rest of the application? Jen was saying earlier that in your case, where you really do have a story here, you really do want to communicate, why are you doing this? You know, why are you making this transition between fields? Why are you pursuing a degree? There is really an opportunity to dig into that in your essays, in your written material. So I really recommend making sure that those are getting the time that you need. And then if you go, well, then I only have like an extra hour every week to study for the GRE. In that case, I might go, well, are you actually going to get anything out of a retake? I see some students who just retake. They don't really study. They just go in and they take it again. Or they go in and they take it again, and it's been long enough that they're out of practice and they might even do worse than they previously did. With a retake, you want to make sure that you are investing in it. I typically find that, just going back and doing it a second time, there is value in that because you've done it before, you've got some comfort, so there's an advantage there, in just that it's your second time doing it. But you want to make sure that you have studied, that you have seen improvement in your practice tests, so that when you're going back, you're not spending the money on nothing. You're not spending the time on nothing. So evaluate, at this point, do I have the time to make it worth my while, or is that time better invested in another part of my application? The other thing that I would say here is that it's completely dependent on your situation. Are those schools test optional? Does one of those cases of where, a GRE score might help you, does that apply to you? And really kind of evaluating, how do the other elements of my application stack up? So I would take a moment to assess your situation, both in terms of like, what does it mean for your application, but what does it mean for your own time, and the value of that time. Okay. Taking a look, Jen, is there anything else you wanted to add there?
Nope, I think that's exactly right. I think, also in doing the retake, I would never advise to just go take a retake without doing any additional work. But I think, again, sitting back, give yourself a break, first of all, like after you take, this isn't probably exactly in your situation, Ahmad, but, sit back and don't make a decision in the first, I would say even week, if you don't have to, after you take the test. But one thing that I've advised students in the past is to, I love thinking about process. So sitting down and thinking about the day of the test, if you didn't get a score quite where you wanted, is there anything about that test day that, stands out to you? Like I said, did you hit that traffic jam that like really threw you off? Did something happen at the testing center that wasn't, kind of what you expected? Were you having, was there something that like was thrown off? And that's not going to stop you from studying more, but that may help you to think about like, what are the conditions? Do I need to take more practice tests specifically because like it was really hard for me to focus for the amount of the test, and I need to build that endurance muscle more than the content muscle? Was it that you weren't finishing sections? I always, when I haven't advised the GRE in a while, but I always told my GRE students to look at that free report afterwards that like, gives you some sort of information about like, yeah, did you not answer the last 4 questions in a section? Because that might tell you like the thing I need to work on for my next retake is like strategy. It's my timing. Like I need to really buckle down on doing a 2-stage approach, getting that low-hanging fruit questions. Or, if you write down afterwards, like, I just felt like all of these questions, I didn't understand them, then that might be like, I need to go back and do some content review. So write down a couple of thoughts, take a break, come back to it, and sort of evaluate from there, with that sort of guided, I need to build endurance, I need to build content, I need to build strategy.
Yeah. The other thing I would add is if you did take a practice test or multiple practice tests before your exam, compare how you did on those practice tests to how you did on your test day. If you did about the same or better on your test day, all right, then it probably means that like it is going to be, effort on content, on strategy, that you scored the way you were supposed to, right? And you would have to put in significant effort to improve. Now, if you scored lower on test day than on your previous practice test, either there was something wrong with those practice tests, maybe they weren't realistic or you weren't taking them realistically, or it means that there was something weird about test day. And that might just mean that it was the pressure of test day. And there are things that you can do to practice to deal with that, but that means that you have the capability to score higher, and it's unlocking that in the context of test day. So that might be a scenario where I would go, a retake could really benefit you if you are able to unlock that higher scoring that you already have on that test day.
For sure. The final thing I'll say about the retake, just sort of to Erika's point about thinking about how much time you realistically have, is to also think critically about what part of the test you're trying to improve. So if you're trying to make a really big jump in, let's say, the verbal section, and you only have 3, like you're taking that 21 days and you got to take it by then, you're going to want to really sit down and think about like, can I get where I want to go? We know that verbal just takes longer. It's just harder to see improvement on. And so that may be something where you're going to have to sit down and make that evaluation of like, is it worth spending 3 weeks cramming this to get, a gain? The other thing is like, how far off are you? Are you 2 or 3 points off of the average admitted students? I'm not worried about that because again, this is an average. Like if you're a couple points off, like in most circumstances, I would say like, take it, run, do the next thing. If it's a larger, gap, or if you really do feel like, hey, I was way outperforming on my practice exams, then that's something. But I've seen a lot of students go through a lot of hassle and a lot of money to try to move up a couple of points. And I think in most cases, that's not really moving the needle with your actual application.
Absolutely. Okay, last chance for any questions, but I think we might be good. As a reminder, you can check out this link. You should be able to see that in the chat if you want to get GRE and admission support from Magoosh. Like Jen was saying, it's a really good deal. And it aligns with what we're saying here, which is to focus on both pieces. Jen, is there anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Good luck with admission season. Definitely, watch our other content, check out our admissions blog. There's a lot there, especially when you're getting started right now, but you're going to get through it. Carve out small pieces, tackle one thing at a time as you go forward. It feels a lot easier if you just say, okay, for the next 2 weeks, every day, I'm going to research one school and go down a list rather than saying, I have to study, 30 schools, whether I should go to them or not, like in a weekend. So make it easier on yourself. You belong in graduate school. We believe that here at Magoosh. You got this. Anything you have to say on the way out, Erika?
Ditto. You got it. And we hope to see you at another live stream or in Magoosh. All right. Well, thanks very much for being here this morning or this afternoon or this evening or whatever time it is for you. And we will see you next time.
Awesome. Bye, y'all.
Bye.